Sarah Johnson sat quietly on the hard wooden bench in courtroom 302, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The traffic court was busy that Monday morning, filled with the usual shuffle of feet and whispered conversations. She watched as person after person stepped forward to face Judge William Harrison, who looked down from his elevated bench with an expression that seemed permanently stuck between boredom and irritation. Sarah hadn't planned to be here today. She had a crucial voting rights meeting scheduled for the afternoon, and her morning was supposed to be spent preparing documents for an upcoming case. But here she was, dealing with a parking ticket she'd gotten while helping an elderly voter register for the upcoming election. The parking meter had expired just 10 minutes over the limit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she waited, their harsh glow reflecting off the polished floor. Sarah adjusted her simple navy blazer and checked her watch again. She'd already been waiting for 2 hours, watching as Judge Harrison handled each case with barely concealed impatience. Some people left the courtroom looking relieved, others frustrated, but there was a pattern she couldn't help noticing, one that made her stomach tighten with each passing case. Sarah Johnson, the court clerk called out, her voice echoing through the chamber. Case number 47,892, parking violation on Madison Street. Sarah stood up, smoothing her knee-length skirt as she walked to the podium. Her sensible black heels clicked against the floor, the sound seeming unusually loud in the sudden quiet. She could feel eyes on her, but she kept her head high and her expression neutral, just as she'd done in countless professional situations before. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers. His silver hair caught the fluorescent light, and his round glasses sat low on his nose. He was in his early 60s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent too many years frowning at people from behind his bench. "Ms. Johnson," he drawled, drawing out her name in a way that made it sound like an accusation. "You were parked in a metered spot for..." He paused, squinting at the citation, 45 minutes in a 30-minute zone. "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah replied clearly, her voice steady and professional. "I can explain the circumstances." "The circumstances?" Judge Harrison cut her off, finally looking up, "are that you broke the law." His eyes swept over her dismissively, taking in her professional attire but seeming to see something entirely different. "This is your third parking violation this year." Sarah blinked in surprise. "That wasn't correct." "Your Honor, I believe there's a mistake. This is my first." "Are you questioning the court's records, Ms. Johnson?" Judge Harrison's voice carried a warning tone that made several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. He shuffled through some papers on his desk, pulling out what he claimed was her record. Sarah could see from where she stood that the paper had a different middle initial than hers. She opened her mouth to point out the error, but Judge Harrison was already speaking again. "Given your repeated disregard for parking ordinances and your..." He paused, looking her up and down again, "attitude, I'm setting the fine at $500. This should serve as a reminder to follow the law." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the court clerk looked up from her computer, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. The standard fine for a first-time parking violation was $50. Everyone knew that. Sarah stood perfectly still, her face a mask of composure even as she felt her heart racing. 15 years of fighting for voting rights had taught her when to speak and when to stay silent. This moment required careful handling. "Your Honor," she said quietly but firmly, "I would like to request a moment to verify the records you're referring to. The person in those documents appears to have a different middle initial than mine." Judge Harrison's face flushed slightly red. "Ms. Johnson, are you suggesting that I don't know how to read a simple court record?" "No, Your Honor. I'm simply requesting verification of the facts." The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. "The fine stands at $500, Ms. Johnson. Pay it within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case." Sarah remained at the podium for a moment longer, her mind already racing through the legal implications of what had just transpired. She had seen instances of judicial bias before. It was part of why she dedicated her life to civil rights work, but experiencing it firsthand was different. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the young reporter in the back of the courtroom, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw recognition flash across his face. She knew then that this story was far from over. With dignity intact and her head held high, Sarah walked out of courtroom 302. She had a voting rights meeting to prepare for, and now, it seemed, she had another battle for justice on her hands. On the same afternoon after the court hearing, Sarah Johnson sat in her modest office at the Voting Rights Action Center. The walls were covered with framed newspaper clippings and thank you letters from community members. A large map of the state hung behind her desk, covered in colorful pins marking the locations where her organization had helped secure voting access for underserved communities. 15 years ago, this office had been nothing more than a small storage room with a borrowed desk and a broken chair. Sarah smiled as she remembered those early days, when she was fresh out of law school with nothing but determination and a dream of making voting accessible to everyone. She had started alone, working late into the night, using her own savings to keep the lights on. The memory of her grandmother, Martha, flooded her thoughts. Martha had been turned away from voting booths 3 times in her life, each time with a different excuse. "Baby," she had told Sarah during her last days, "make sure nobody else has to fight as hard as I did just to have their voice heard." Those words had become Sarah's driving force. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, her deputy director. "Channel 7 wants to talk about what happened in court today. The story's getting attention." Sarah put the phone down without replying. She hadn't gone to court looking for publicity. That wasn't her style. Through the glass walls of her office, Sarah could see her team of 20 dedicated staff members busy at work. What had started as a one-woman mission had grown into one of the most respected civil rights organizations in the state. Last year alone, they had helped over 50,000 people register to vote and had successfully challenged discriminatory voting practices in 5 counties. Jenny, her young assistant, knocked on the door frame. "Ms. Johnson, the governor's office is online too. They want to discuss the new voter ID legislation." Sarah nodded, reaching for her phone. This was her real work, the quiet, persistent effort to change systems from within. As she waited for the call to connect, Sarah's eyes fell on a photograph on her desk. It showed her standing with a group of elderly residents outside a newly opened polling station in River Heights, a predominantly black neighborhood that had gone without a voting location for 30 years. The joy on their faces as they proudly displayed their "I voted" stickers still brought tears to her eyes. The organization's success hadn't come easily. Sarah remembered the countless nights spent reviewing legal documents, the doors slammed in her face, and the threatening letters she received when she first started challenging the status quo. But she had persisted, building relationships with community leaders, election officials, and even those who initially opposed her work. Her methods were always professional and strategic. Instead of loud protests, she preferred careful documentation and precise legal arguments. Rather than public confrontations, she chose patient negotiation and education. This approach had earned her respect from both allies and opponents, though many people who benefited from her work had never seen her face. The governor's assistant came on the line, but Sarah's mind briefly wandered to Judge Harrison's courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same system she had spent years with. As she gathered her papers for the evening, Sarah's mind was already focused on tomorrow's challenges. The fine she'd received might have been unfair, but it had given her a renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes, she thought, the most important victories come disguised as defeats. The morning after Sarah's court appearance, David Chen, a young reporter for the City Herald, sat at his desk, fingers flying across his keyboard. He couldn't believe his luck at having been in that courtroom. As the only reporter who had witnessed the incident firsthand, he knew he had a story that needed to be told. Local judge fines prominent civil rights attorney $500 for minor parking violation, read his headline. David had spent the night researching Sarah Johnson's background, amazed that he hadn't recognized her immediately. Her work had changed voting laws across the state, yet she had managed to stay largely out of the spotlight. By 9 a.m., the story was live on the City Herald's website. Within an hour, other news outlets began picking it up. Sarah's phone started ringing nonstop, but she continued with her regular meetings, letting all calls go to voicemail. Her assistant, Jenny, had to put up a "no press" sign on their office door as reporters began showing up uninvited. Social media exploded with the news. Someone had found a video from a security camera in the courthouse hallway, showing Sarah's dignified exit from the courtroom. The clip went viral, with people commenting on her composure in the face of obvious discrimination. Hashtag Justice for Sarah and hashtag Judge Harrison resigns started trending locally. Then came the flood of similar stories. A local Facebook group became a gathering place for others who had faced Judge Harrison's harsh treatment. Mary Williams, a black high school teacher, shared how she had been fined $300 for a broken taillight, while her white colleague had received only a warning for the same offense the previous week. James Rodriguez, a Latino business owner, described being talked down to and fined heavily for a minor zoning violation that other businesses regularly got away with. By lunchtime, local TV stations had set up their vans outside the courthouse. Judge Harrison's clerk informed him that he had become the top trending topic in the state. The judge, who had never bothered with social media, sat in his chambers, watching his carefully built reputation crumble through the local news coverage on his small office television. Sarah's colleague Marcus created a spreadsheet to document all the cases people were sharing online. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Minorities consistently received fines that were 3 to 5 times higher than those given to white defendants for the same violations. The data painted a clear picture of systemic bias. At 2 p.m., the State Bar Association released a statement. "We are deeply concerned by the reports of potentially discriminatory practices in our judicial system. These allegations will be thoroughly investigated." The carefully worded message sent ripples through the legal community. Local civil rights groups began organizing a peaceful protest outside the courthouse. People showed up with signs reading "Justice should be colorblind" and "Equal treatment under law." News helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial shots of the growing crowd. Sarah watched all of this unfold from her office, where she was focused on preparing for an important voting rights case. When her phone rang for the 100th time that day, she finally answered it. It was Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman she had helped register to vote. "Child," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice shaking with emotion, "my whole church group is watching this on TV. We're all praying for you. But more than that, we're proud of you. The way you held your head high in that courtroom, that's teaching our young people something powerful." Late in the afternoon, a different kind of story started emerging. People began sharing positive experiences of working with Sarah's voting rights organization. Stories of her quiet dedication, of nights spent helping elderly residents get their documentation in order, of patient explanations of complex voting requirements to confused citizens. The narrative was shifting from outrage over injustice to appreciation for years of unsung service. The evening news led with the story on every local channel. Political commentators debated the implications, civil rights experts weighed in, and social media continued to buzz with activity. What had started as a simple traffic court incident had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about justice and equality. Through it all, Sarah maintained her usual routine. She left her office at her regular time, politely declining to comment to the reporters waiting outside. As she drove home, radio stations were still discussing the story, but her mind was already on tomorrow's voting rights meeting. She knew that real change didn't come from media storms. It came from steady, persistent work behind the scenes. But as she pulled into her driveway, even Sarah had to admit that sometimes a little public attention could speed up the pace of progress. Her phone buzzed with a message. The State Judicial Review Board wanted to meet with her first thing tomorrow morning. The State Judicial Review Board's office was located on the top floor of a tall glass building in the city center. On a bright Thursday morning, 5 board members sat around a large oak table, reviewing hundreds of pages of court records spread before them. The investigation into Judge Harrison's sentencing practices had begun in earnest. Linda Martinez, the board's chief investigator, pushed her reading glasses up her nose as she studied a detailed spreadsheet. Her team had spent the past week gathering data from every traffic court session Judge Harrison had presided over in the last 3 years. The numbers told a disturbing story. "Look at these patterns," Linda said, pointing to a color-coded chart. "When we break down the fines by race, the disparities are impossible to ignore. Black defendants paid an average of 340% more than white defendants for the same violations. Hispanic defendants faced similar discrimination." The room was quiet except for the sound of papers shuffling and pens scratching notes. Robert Thompson, the ward's senior member, had seen many investigations in his 30 years of service, but this one felt different. The evidence was unusually clear-cut. Down in the courthouse archives, a team of junior investigators worked through dusty boxes of old case files. They found handwritten notes from Judge Harrison that revealed his prejudices. Comments about defendants' appearances, assumptions about their characters based on their names or addresses, and dismissive remarks about their explanations. Sarah Johnson's case had opened a door that couldn't be closed. More people were coming forward every day, sharing their experiences through a special hotline the board had set up. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a pattern of bias that stretched back to the beginning of Judge Harrison's career. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison himself sat in his chambers, facing his own lawyer. The judge's usual confidence had crumbled as he reviewed copies of his own records. Looking at his past decisions laid out in black and white, he couldn't deny the obvious patterns anymore. "I just followed my instincts about people," he tried to explain to his attorney, who winced at these words. "I thought I was being fair." Back at the review board, Linda's team made another discovery. They found that Judge Harrison's harsh sentences had disproportionately affected neighborhoods where Sarah Johnson's voting rights organization had been most active. Whether this was deliberate or unconscious bias, it added another troubling layer to the investigation. By midday, the board received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chen, a court translator who had worked in Judge Harrison's courtroom for years, came forward with a box of personal notes. She had documented numerous instances where the judge had rushed through cases involving non-English speakers, sometimes not even waiting for complete translations of defendants' statements. "I always felt uncomfortable," Mrs. Chen told the investigators, her hands shaking slightly as she handed over her notebooks. "But I was afraid to speak up before. When I saw what happened to Ms. Johnson, I knew it was time to share what I had seen." The investigation spread beyond just traffic court. The board began reviewing Judge Harrison's decisions in small claims court, family court, and other civil cases. Each new area they examined revealed similar patterns of discriminatory treatment. Sarah's own legal team provided additional context. They shared statistics about voting rights cases in Judge Harrison's district, showing how his rulings had often created obstacles for minority voters. This information helped the board understand the broader impact of his biased decisions. Late that afternoon, Linda Martinez stood at a whiteboard, drawing connections between different pieces of evidence. The picture was becoming clearer with each new detail. This wasn't just about one parking ticket or one judge's bad day. It was about years of systematic bias affecting thousands of lives. The board's youngest member, James Wilson, spoke up during their final meeting of the day. "We need to look at the system that allowed this to continue for so long. How many other judges might be showing similar patterns?" His question hung in the air, making everyone uncomfortable. They all knew this investigation might be just the beginning of a much larger examination of the entire judicial system. As the sun set over the city, Linda sealed another box of evidence and added it to the growing collection. Tomorrow, they would begin interviews with courthouse staff, other judges, and more citizens who had faced Judge Harrison's bias. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was already clear. Sarah Johnson's simple parking ticket had exposed problems that went far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. The community center on Oak Street was packed with people, all gathered for an emergency town hall meeting about Judge Harrison's case. Every seat was taken, and people stood along the walls, their faces showing a mix of anger and determination. Local civil rights leaders had called the meeting, but what happened next surprised everyone. Sarah Johnson walked onto the stage, her presence immediately quieting the angry murmurs in the room. She looked calm and professional in her navy suit, just as she had in the courtroom that day. But instead of talking about her own experience, she pulled out a thick folder of papers. "Today isn't about me or Judge Harrison," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about building a better justice system for everyone." She clicked a button, and a large screen behind her lit up with statistics about court cases in their city. The crowd watched in silence as Sarah showed them numbers that told a bigger story. It wasn't just about unfair traffic fines anymore. The data revealed problems in housing courts, family courts, and criminal courts. Judge Harrison's case had opened people's eyes to much bigger issues. In the audience, Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman Sarah had helped register to vote, nodded in agreement. She remembered her own struggles with the court system years ago. Next to her sat David Chen, the reporter who had first broken the story. He was writing quickly in his notebook, impressed by how Sarah was handling the situation. Outside the community center, protesters had gathered with signs demanding Judge Harrison's removal. But inside, Sarah was teaching people about their rights and explaining how the court system worked. She handed out simple guides that explained what people could do if they faced unfair treatment in court. Anger is natural, she told the crowd, but change comes through understanding and action. She then introduced a team of volunteer lawyers who had offered to review cases of people who thought they had been treated unfairly by Judge Harrison. Local church groups and community organizations started setting up information tables around the room. They helped people fill out forms to report their experiences to the State Judicial Review Board. Sarah had turned a protest into a workshop for positive change. Marcus, Sarah's deputy director, watched from the back of the room with a smile. This was typical Sarah, taking a personal injustice and using it to help others. He remembered how she had built her voting rights organization the same way, turning each challenge into an opportunity to educate and empower people. The local TV news crews were surprised. They had come expecting angry speeches and calls for revenge. Instead, they found people working together, learning about their rights, and planning for real changes in the system. It wasn't as exciting as a protest, but it was more important. Jenny, Sarah's assistant, was busy collecting stories from people in the crowd. Each person who shared their experience with Judge Harrison received information about their rights and connected with others who had similar experiences. The community was coming together, supporting each other instead of just being angry. Even some of Judge Harrison's supporters came to the meeting. They had expected to defend him, but found themselves learning things they hadn't known about their own court system. A few of them even joined the volunteer groups, saying they wanted to be part of the solution. Sarah moved through the crowd, listening to people's stories and offering quiet words of encouragement. She stopped to help an elderly man understand his court documents, just as she had done countless times in her voting rights work. This wasn't about getting revenge on one judge. It was about fixing a broken system. By the end of the evening, the angry crowd had transformed into organized groups with clear goals and plans. They had created committees to monitor court sessions, set up a system to help people file complaints about unfair treatment, and started planning educational workshops about the justice system. As people left the community center, they carried not just information packets, but also a new sense of hope. Sarah's calm leadership had shown them that real change was possible, not through shouting and anger, but through education, organization, and peaceful action. Later that night, as Sarah packed up the last of the materials, a young girl approached her. "My mom got a big fine from Judge Harrison last year," she said. "But tonight you taught us how to make things better, not just how to be mad about them." Sarah smiled at the girl, knowing that this was how real change happened. One person, one story, one lesson at a time. The media storm around her case would eventually die down, but the movement for justice that started in that community center would continue growing stronger. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his home office, surrounded by newspaper clippings and printouts of online articles. The evening light cast long shadows across his desk as he read through another story about Sarah Johnson's work in voting rights. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as he dove deeper into learning about the woman he had found in his courtroom. The more he read, the harder it became to breathe. Sarah Johnson wasn't just any lawyer. She was a hero to thousands of people. She had helped elderly veterans get to polling stations, worked with disabled citizens to ensure their voting access, and fought for fair voting practices in poor neighborhoods. And he had treated her like a common criminal over a parking ticket. His hands shook as he opened his laptop to watch a video of Sarah speaking at a law school graduation last year. In it, she talked about justice and fairness with a quiet passion that made his own recent actions seem even more shameful. The young woman he had looked down upon from his bench had done more for justice in her 15 years of work than he had in his 30 years as a judge. "William?" His wife called from the doorway. "You've been in here all day." He looked up, and she could see the tears in his eyes. "I've made terrible mistakes, Martha," he said quietly. "So many mistakes." Martha walked over and looked at the articles spread across his desk. She had been trying to tell him for years about his harsh treatment of certain defendants, but he had always dismissed her concerns. Now, facing the evidence of his bias, he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. His phone buzzed, another message from the Judicial Review Board. They wanted him to respond to more allegations of biased sentencing. Judge Harrison picked up the phone, but didn't reply right away. Instead, he opened his court records from the past year and began reading through his own decisions with new eyes. The patterns were clear now. He had been harder on people of color, quicker to dismiss their explanations, more likely to assume the worst about their intentions. How had he not seen it before? The realization hit him like a physical pain in his chest. Late into the night, he found himself watching videos of people sharing their experiences from his courtroom. Each story added to the weight of his shame. A black mother who lost her job because she couldn't pay his excessive fine. A Hispanic student whose college plans were delayed because of his harsh sentence for a minor violation. And now Sarah Johnson, whose only crime had been trying to help someone register to vote. At midnight, Judge Harrison started writing. Not a legal defense or an official statement, but a letter, first to Sarah Johnson, then to every person he could remember treating unfairly in his courtroom. He wrote about his realizations, his shame, and his desire to make things right. "I was wrong," he wrote in each letter. "My bias affected my judgment, and you paid the price for my failure to see my own prejudices." The next morning, his wife found him still at his desk, surrounded by letters. "I need to do more than just apologize," he told her. "I need to change." He called the State Judicial Training Center and asked about their bias awareness programs. Then he contacted local community leaders, including some who had been critical of him, asking to meet and learn from their experiences. For the first time in his career, Judge Harrison was ready to listen rather than judge. When he finally replied to the Judicial Review Board, he didn't make excuses or try to defend his actions. Instead, he admitted his mistakes and asked for their help in making amends. He knew he might lose his position on the bench, but somehow that seemed less important now than trying to right his wrongs. Later that week, he sat in the back row of a community meeting where Sarah Johnson was speaking. He listened as she talked about building a better justice system, one that worked fairly for everyone. The judge who had once looked down on her now found himself looking up to her as an example of what true justice meant. As he drove home that evening, Judge Harrison passed the courthouse where he had presided for so many years. The building looked different to him now, not as a place of authority, but as a place of responsibility. He had failed at responsibility, but perhaps his revelation could be the start of something better. Sometimes, he realized, the hardest judgment to face is the one we must pass on ourselves. 3 months after the parking ticket incident, the city courthouse looked different. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors, and a help desk staffed by volunteer law students assisted people with their paperwork. These changes had started with Judge Harrison's own request for reform. The judge sat in a classroom at the State Judicial Training Center, taking notes like a first-year law student. He had traded his black robes for a simple suit, and his usual stern expression had softened into one of concentration. Around him, 20 other judges from across the state listened as Sarah Johnson led a workshop on recognizing unconscious bias. "Bias isn't always obvious," Sarah explained, standing at the front of the room. "Sometimes it hides in the small decisions we make every day." She clicked to a slide showing examples from real court cases, including some from Judge Harrison's past decisions. The judge didn't flinch when his old cases appeared on the screen. Instead, he raised his hand to share what he had learned from his mistakes. His honesty encouraged other judges to speak up about their own struggles with bias. The room buzzed with meaningful conversation instead of defensive arguments. Back in his courtroom, Judge Harrison had made dramatic changes. He now started each session by explaining court procedures in plain language. He listened more carefully to explanations from defendants and asked questions to better understand their situations. Most importantly, he regularly reviewed his own decisions to check for signs of bias. Linda Martinez from the Judicial Review Board sat in the back of his courtroom, monitoring these changes. She watched as the judge handled a case similar to Sarah's, a minor parking violation. This time, he asked questions about the circumstances, listened carefully to the answers, and issued a fair warning instead of a harsh fine. "The transformation is remarkable," Linda wrote in her report. "Judge Harrison has gone from being an example of the problem to becoming a model for change." The judge's example inspired others. Other courts in the state began adopting similar reforms. Training programs on bias awareness became mandatory for all judicial staff. Even the courthouse security guards and clerks attended workshops on treating everyone with equal respect. Sarah's organization helped create simple guides explaining court procedures in 10 different languages. These guides were now available in every courthouse in the state, Judge Harrison had personally insisted on having them displayed prominently in his courthouse's entrance. One morning, the judge arrived early to find a long line of people waiting outside the courthouse. But unlike the tense, worried crowds of the past, these people were there for a free legal advice clinic he had helped organize. Volunteer lawyers, including some he had once treated harshly in his courtroom, were there to help people understand their rights. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had supported Sarah during the parking ticket incident, now led a team of community volunteers who helped people navigate the court system. She often saw Judge Harrison stopping to chat with visitors, asking about their experiences and listening to their suggestions for improvement. The local bar association invited both Sarah and Judge Harrison to speak at their annual meeting. Together, they shared the story of how a parking ticket had led to meaningful changes in the justice system. Their presentation ended with practical steps other courts could take to become more fair and accessible. Even the physical layout of Judge Harrison's courtroom had changed. The judge's bench was lower, making him seem less intimidating. The seating area had been rearranged to be more welcoming. Signs in multiple languages explained court procedures, and a court translator was always available. One day, a young law student interviewed Judge Harrison for a paper on judicial reform. "What made you change?" she asked. The judge thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes we need someone to show us our reflection clearly," he said. "Ms. Johnson didn't just point out what was wrong. She showed me how to make it right." The story of Judge Harrison's transformation began appearing in judicial training materials across the country. Other courts started calling to learn more about the changes he had implemented. What had started with one parking ticket was now influencing the entire legal system. Sarah watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. She knew that real transformation wasn't just about changing one judge or one courthouse. It was about changing the way people thought about justice. And in Judge Harrison's courtroom, that change was happening one case at a time. 1 year had passed since the day Sarah Johnson stood in Judge Harrison's courtroom over a parking ticket. The autumn sun streamed through the courthouse windows as a large crowd gathered for a special ceremony. The old building looked different now, more welcoming, with signs in multiple languages and helpful staff ready to assist visitors. Today was the official launch of the Equal Justice Initiative, a new program that would spread the reforms tested in Judge Harrison's courtroom to every courthouse in the state. Sarah and the judge stood side by side on the podium, an image that would have seemed impossible a year ago. What began as a moment of injustice, Sarah said to the gathered crowd, has grown into a movement for change. She gestured to the screens showing live video feeds from 5 other courthouses across the state, all implementing the same reforms simultaneously. Judge Harrison, his silver hair now accompanied by a gentler smile, stepped up to the microphone. "Ms. Johnson taught me that true justice isn't about power," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet hall. "It's about understanding, fairness, and the courage to admit when we're wrong." In the audience, familiar faces filled the rows. Mrs. Thompson sat with her church group, all wearing buttons that read "Justice for All." David Chen, the reporter who first covered the story, was taking notes for a book he was writing about the transformation of the state's justice system. The new courthouse guidelines, bound in blue folders on every seat, contained practical changes that had emerged from the past year's experiences. Every fine now came with a clear explanation and a process for appeal. Court sessions were recorded and reviewed regularly for signs of bias. Community members served as observers in courtrooms, ensuring fairness in daily proceedings. Linda Martinez from the Judicial Review Board presented their latest findings. The numbers told a powerful story. Complaints of unfair treatment had dropped by 70%. Payment plans for fines were now available to everyone, and not a single person had lost their job due to inability to pay court fees in the past 6 months. But the most significant changes were visible in the small moments. A Spanish-speaking grandmother easily found help at the information desk. A young black man confidently presented his case in traffic court, knowing he would be heard fairly. A Muslim woman wearing a hijab served as a volunteer court translator, helping others navigate the system. Sarah's voting rights organization had grown too, with offices now in 3 cities. The publicity from the parking ticket incident had brought attention to her years of quiet work, leading to increased funding and support. But she still spent most of her time in the community, helping one person at a time. Judge Harrison had become a different kind of leader. He now taught at the Judicial Training Center, sharing his story with new judges. Look for your blind spots, he would tell them, because we all have them. The question is whether we have the courage to face them. The ceremony included the unveiling of a new plaque in the courthouse lobby. It read, "Justice grows through understanding. Every case deserves to be heard with fairness, dignity, and respect." Below these words was a simple image, a parking meter with a small tree growing beside it, symbolizing how positive change can grow from unexpected places. After the main ceremony, people gathered in small groups to share their experiences. A young law student told Sarah how the changes had inspired her to become a public defender. A retired judge admitted to Judge Harrison that he too was reviewing his past decisions with new eyes. As the day drew to a close, Sarah and Judge Harrison walked through the courthouse together, talking about future plans. They stopped at courtroom 302, where their story had begun. The room had been renovated, the judge's bench was lower, the seating more comfortable, and the walls decorated with artwork from local schools showing what justice meant to children. "Sometimes," Sarah said, looking around the transformed space, "the best changes come from the hardest moments." Judge Harrison nodded, remembering his own journey. "And sometimes," he added, "what looks like an ending is really just a beginning." Outside the courthouse, new signs displayed the day's court schedule in 5 languages. A group of law students helped visitors find their way. The parking meter where Sarah's story began had been replaced with a bike rack and a small garden. As the sun set over the city, the courthouse stood as a symbol of what was possible when people chose to learn from their mistakes and work together for change. The story of a parking ticket had become a lesson in justice, one that would continue teaching new generations of judges, lawyers, and citizens that real change starts with the courage to look at ourselves honestly and the wisdom to learn from those we once judged wrongly.